This is IndieVelo, an online cycling platform that allows you to structure workouts and race and have social rides and just generally ride around an online world with your bike and smart trainer. Except as of today, it's not called IndieVelo anymore. And coming down the road, it won't be free either. That's because today, TrainingPeaks announced the acquisition of IndieVelo, both the platform and game as a whole, as well as its sole employee, George Gilbert. And the name is interesting here because most times I don't really talk about individual people in my video, but in this one case, IndieVelo is just one person. It's one person supporting 40,000 users that have signed up for IndieVelo accounts over the last year and a half or so. And of course, even more notable is the fact that IndieVelo has been free. George always said IndieVelo would be free during beta, but beyond that, who knew? Of course, there was a founders tier, but that tier didn't really get you much else. It got you a few little like early access to certain beta types and stuff like that, but by and large, everyone got the same thing across the board. So in this video, I want to talk about what's changing with IndieVelo, what's changing with TrainingPeaks, how this is going to impact the competitors around the landscape, and just a bunch of other random thoughts that I think are interesting along the way. So as I mentioned earlier on, IndieVelo is a cycling platform. If you haven't heard of it before, that's probably normal. It's kind of new in the grand scheme of things. But unlike some of the other cycling platforms that have been announced in the last couple years, this one already exists and already has users. It's got apps for all the most common platforms like Apple TV and iOS and Mac and PC and so on down the road. So you can use it on pretty much anything you want, and you can use it with any smart trainer you want as well. It also supports other sensor types, so power meters and cadence sensors and things like that. Now first we need to do a little bit of a history dip into IndieVelo because it's really fascinating and will have a big impact on what happens down the road here. I should note, by the way, this video is sponsored by Precision Fuel and Hydration. More about them a little bit later on in the video. So IndieVelo, as I mentioned earlier on, was started by George about a year and a half or so ago. George came from Zwift. Well, technically he was like a freelance contractor to Zwift, and he was in charge of Zada, or Zwift's anti-doping agency. Basically the group that was responsible for catching cheaters within Zwift. Now some of you, I can hear you already, are like, Zwift doesn't really do a good job at catching any cheaters. Why would we trust this guy? And that's true to a degree, except George wasn't in charge of the cheaters that you're thinking about. George was in charge of the pro-level people, so basically pros racing for money. And those people we've absolutely heard about in Zwift being caught and being hung out to dry and losing their UCI racing licenses and stuff like that for a year. Like, that was banned. Those are big deal bans. Versus when you and I race, Zwift like kind of pretends to care about cheating there and does a couple little like kid glove things around that, but basically, if you and I cheat, nothing actually happens. But when those people cheat, they get banned from cycling in sport. And that's the area George was over. So within that realm, he developed a lot of things. And one of those things he developed was around performance verification. The idea that you could look at the characteristics of stuff like this particular trainer or that particular power meter, and then with big data sets, start to figure out which trainers or power meters might be more prone to inaccuracy. From there, they can start doing detection and figure out when someone is likely cheating or when someone just simply has a miscalibrated power meter or a trainer that's old and stinky and doesn't really have good power. Of course, all that fancy stuff is really only happening behind the scenes, mostly after the fact, and again, mostly for those pro-level races. It's not happening in real time for everyone else. So George decided to develop an application called IndieVelo, and that application would be used as a technology demonstrator. The idea being that he can demonstrate how those different things can be applied in real time when built into the foundations of the application. And his idea was to go ahead and license out those different kind of technology components in the same way that like Firstbeat would have licensed out different components of heart rate algorithms and stuff like that, at least before Garmin bought them. Of course, the problem that George ultimately ended up having was there's really only like 5 to 7 viable customers worldwide for his product. In other words, you're only talking about things like Zwift and Be Cool and Rouvy and others that would potentially license his algorithms and sort of the stuff he's developed, which most of those companies were just going to do that in-house or not care about it because it just wasn't really too high on their like priority list, if you will. So instead, George just kept on expanding IndieVelo out as an application, and people kept joining it. It was free to use. It's been free to use. Yes, there was a founders club, like I mentioned earlier on. So of course, as IndieVelo grew more and more popular, the question then became like, what was the end game here? Like, how would George, a single developer developing this entire thing, supporting a potential user base of 40,000 people, where what was the end game? And the end game is essentially TrainingPeaks has decided to acquire IndieVelo, both a platform and George as a person. He now becomes a full-time employee of IndieVelo, and ultimately will get a team behind him to develop the game faster and further. So in terms of what changes today, well, first off, you can now go ahead and log in with your TrainingPeaks account or your IndieVelo account. And behind the scenes, if you already had your TrainingPeaks account linked up to IndieVelo for either pushing completed workouts to TrainingPeaks or pulling in planned structured workouts into IndieVelo, those two like magically merge behind the scenes. The next most visible change is that it's now called TrainingPeaks Virtual as opposed to IndieVelo. Though you will see little tidbits of IndieVelo like Founders Club and things like that sprinkled about. Those are really the only meaningful changes happening as of today. So if you wouldn't have updated your game today, you'll see those changes already. Then in the short term, what they're going to do is start doing more integration bits within TrainingPeaks. So for example, pulling in your FTP values from TrainingPeaks, pulling your heart rate zones, your power zones, some of your training plan stuff, all that into the game. The timelines on that aren't very clear, but frankly, given how frequently and how quickly George develops features into IndieVelo, I'm going to assume that'll be done by like dinner, maybe even like afternoon snack or something like that. So I don't think that's going to take all that long. Instead, the most important milestone for most of you will be what happens after March of next year. TrainingPeaks has committed to providing free access to IndieVelo through March of 2025, so at least until then. Then after that, at some point, whether it's April or whether it's July or September, things are a bit fuzzy. They're hoping it's April, but it could be anything. It'll then only be accessible via the TrainingPeaks premium subscription. And that's basically $20 a month or $125 a year. Of course, the TrainingPeaks subscription covers your entire TrainingPeaks platform. That's what people normally pay the $20 a month for, and now you're getting IndieVelo for free. And I can, of course, already hear some people upset that, well, now IndieVelo for free, it was free before, now it's not free. Again, George was always very clear at the very beginning of IndieVelo that it's free during the beta period, and after that, who knows? Because nothing is really viable in this world free forever. For example, if you look at like the normal 3 methods of things on the internet or even at large, the way things can be free. Number 1, you're paying via ads or you're paying via your personal data. So we see that with Facebook or YouTube and things like that. Number 2, then being some billionaire comes along and says they want to go ahead and pay for you to have that thing on their behalf. We see that with pro cycling teams all the time. Plenty of billionaires come along, sponsor a pro cycling team for a few years, then get bored, and we know how that all ends, right? That's a well understood story. The third option is not a billionaire, but instead just a billionaire country, government, or some sort of corporation underwrites the cost of the application or the thing that you want, usually in exchange for some sort of like greenwashing, sport washing, whitewashing, whatever you want to call it type of thing. And we've seen that in pro cycling and plenty of other places. And of course, we've also seen that in the indoor cycling realm as well, in the case of MyWoosh, for example, being underwritten by the government of the UAE. So those are basically your 3 sort of things. Everything else you've got to pay for. And if we look at IndieVelo, a lot of people came over from RGT, Road Grand Tours. That was free, and then Wahoo acquired it, still remained free, and then Wahoo realized that having a free app didn't really work out business-wise, and so they killed off the app. Where do those RGT people come from? Well, a lot of them came from other free platforms in the past. Vertigo, for example, they went under. CV Arcade, they went under. And then where do those people come from? More free apps from the mid-2010s or so. A common thread, of course, here being that ultimately people have to get paid to make things long-term be viable. Now, of course, some of you have said, why don't they simply put ads on the billboards inside the game? And the thing is, they've tried that. In fact, Zwift tried that for a while. They would sell ad space to various companies and they put it on the billboards. But the challenge there is that when you're on the trainer on your 7th interval and something, sweat pouring down, or you're racing really hard, you're not generally paying attention to what's on those billboards. That's the way it works. Just like in real life, those billboards out on the side of the Tour de France aren't for the athletes. They're for you watching on TV. Places where advertising does work is things like this YouTube video. In fact, this video right here is sponsored by Precision Fuel and Hydration. They've been sponsoring me as well as my wife for quite a long time in terms of just our daily nutrition needs while I'm out cycling, running, and hiking and doing all my silly adventures. But not just me, also top Tour de France teams, both the men's and the women's side. And there's probably three notable things about their product. Number one, it's actually edible. I know that sounds silly, but I find like a lot of nutrition products just suck when you're out there after long periods of time. I've done some silly long adventures and no problems consuming this stuff day in and day out. Number two, they have basically an online consulting thing where you can call in for free to their sports scientist team. You talk about your exact race goal, your plan, what event you're doing, and they'll give you suggestions on which products you should be using to achieve that goal. And then three, they've got these strategy stickers. If you've seen some of my posts or some of my videos on the Tour de France, the men's and the women's teams, their teams have these little bar stem stickers that basically show the nutrition plan for the day for every single athlete. So then from there, Precision actually made these stickers that you can do the same thing on your stem or your water bottle, or if you have like a race kind of kit, a Ziploc bag, etc., maybe for an aid station or a support crew for an ultra marathon or whatever it is, you can make these stickers with that same sort of thing. I think all that stuff's pretty darn cool. And of course, also cool that you can save 15% on your first order at Precision using the coupon code on the screen right there. Thanks to Precision for sponsoring this video, past videos, the FitFile podcast, etc. It allows me to do this cool stuff without having to turn to like governments and big old corporations or even the odd billionaire to sponsor these videos. That said, if you are a billionaire, you want to sponsor these videos, I think we can work something out. I'm just asking for like a jet and a yacht. I think those two things, that's our starting point. Anyways, as for how this affects the competition, what does this mean for Zwift and TrainerRoad and Exert and Rouvy and all those companies out there? Well, I think there's essentially different buckets. In the case of something like TrainerRoad, I actually don't think it affects them very much at all. And the reason is that one of like the core tenets of TrainingPeaks is that it's real coaches behind the scenes creating those workouts. They do a little bit of dabbling in AI stuff like assisting coaches and stuff like that, but they don't really want to tick off their coaches because the coaches is who funds a lot of the TrainingPeaks platform either directly or indirectly to their athletes. So if they come in there with like a big old AI rush of generating workouts and all that kind of stuff, that's going to tick off all the coaches, and the coaches is who make the real money on TrainingPeaks. So in the case of TrainerRoad, they've pushed heavily into AI generation of workouts and having that all be kind of very automated and looking at all your data, big data stuff and all that. So I don't see those two overlapping too much. I see them as kind of different sort of things. And in some ways, it's relatively similar to Exert as well. Exert is really heavy on the kind of automation and AI side of it. And if you're an Exert today, you're using the entire training log platform that is Exert, and you're probably using that for a reason as opposed to TrainingPeaks. So again, I don't think it's going to impact them either. Instead, we get to the Zwifts, the Rouvies, and the Be Cools of the world. And there it's going to impact them, but only if TrainingPeaks can make it happen. And by that I mean that TrainingPeaks, I've been using TrainingPeaks for like, I don't know, 15, 17 years, something like that, a long time. And there's one truism about TrainingPeaks. It's much like a giant, slow cargo ship, right? It is not sexy, it is not fast, but it is generally stable, and it is generally like you can count on it, right? That's TrainingPeaks' mantra. But it's never at the bleeding edge of technology or even like really quite a bit ways back on the technology train. But that is very different than IndieVelo. IndieVelo has always been on the absolute bleeding edge of incorporating every little bit of technology they can and doing it, again, every single Monday morning. Versus, again, TrainingPeaks is like, we'll get there when we get there. And so TrainingPeaks' challenge now is twofold. One, they need to go ahead and have a reason for all of its existing coaches and subscribers into the TrainingPeaks platform to leverage IndieVelo on its trainers, or now TrainingPeaks Virtual. And there's lots of ways they can do that. For example, right now you can already push workouts into the IndieVelo platform from TrainingPeaks. But what if, for example, your coach could also push in voice notes into IndieVelo, or even video notes? Those are all things they could do to kind of increase that connection, if you will, between the coach and the athlete, which is good for the coaches, and make the workouts more engaging. And frankly, for some coaches, it's probably way easier to record a 30 or 60-second voice note inside of an interval than it is to type up a description of what to do. Like, these are all potential things. So you've got this entire group of people that are already customers of TrainingPeaks that you want to increase their stickiness factor for. But then the other half of that is people that are outside of TrainingPeaks. How do you pull them into the platform? And it's those people that TrainingPeaks is going to have to spend money on to effectively market to. Because IndieVelo did really no marketing whatsoever up until now, right? It was just word of mouth across the board. But now if you want to grow that, you need to have some way to go ahead and reach those people in those different groups. And that's where it'll come down to whether or not TrainingPeaks can execute on that, or if it'll just simply be like another kind of random feature of TrainingPeaks that you never actually use. If they can execute on that and they can find a way to go ahead and kind of capture those new audiences, then the Zwifts of the world will have to worry. But it's going to be a while for that to happen. I would love to see TrainingPeaks do something like offer a $10 tier of just IndieVelo access. I think that could be a really compelling way to get people pulled into IndieVelo that don't necessarily want to spend the $20 a month on a full TrainingPeaks subscription, or don't want to spend that $20 a month on Zwift or other platforms out there. There are lots of things to do, but I think TrainingPeaks is going to have to come out of the shell a little bit in order to really make this pop from an overall like success story standpoint. If they stay in their shell, it's not going to pop. It's just going to be kind of business as usual. And I suspect in a few years we'll find ourselves in the exact same scenario as Wahoo and RGT, which I hope doesn't really happen. I hope that this will grow, and I hope that we'll see IndieVelo become one of the premier platforms out there, because competition is good for everyone. And also, having George get some sleep is also good for everyone as well. With that, hope you found this video interesting or useful. If so, give it a like down below or hit subscribe for plenty more sports technology goodness. Have a good one.